Well, welcome to Broadway Buzz. I'm Joe Gary, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Mamma Mia. To quote ABBA, SOS. The Super Troopers are focusing on the dancing queen who's about to say, I do, I do, I do, I do, I do. For those of you who remember ABBA, of course, they were a greatly beloved rock group. They were second only to the Beatles in terms of worldwide importance. They sold 350 million records in their day. They were absolutely extraordinary. And of course, it is their music that is the basis for this delightful and groundbreaking show, Mamma Mia. Now, to set up the word show business, the show part of this, 50 million people have seen Mamma Mia worldwide. It has played in 350 cities. There have been 50 major productions of it literally all over the world. So from Germany to Argentina and from Japan to London, this show has beguiled and bedazzled audiences literally around the world. It's a phenomenal show. It was created literally by three women who had the idea of taking the ABBA music and turning it into a musical, which has happened in the most extraordinary way. Keep in mind, this show has generated over $2 billion. So when we worry about what's going on in Greece, etc., all we had to do was send Mamma Mia there, and perhaps it would have solved the financial problems there. In any case, let me go back to the beginning. First of all, I want to talk about the creation of ABBA and their music. The time is the late 1960s. The place is Stockholm. The people are four young, hungry artists, two young men who are both singers and songwriters, two young women who are singers who have tremendous vocal range. Each of them start their careers separately. Fate played a very important part in the creation of this group. So in the early 1970s, Benny Andersson, who would be one of the great composers and lyricists and performers of ABBA, started his career by creating a boy band that he traveled with, and they would travel around to these little parks all through Sweden, and they were called folk parks. And all four of these people did the same thing. Another young man, Björn Ulvaenik, started a group also. He wrote music and wrote lyrics. Keep in mind, these musicians were all singing in perfect sort of American English, creating lyrics that were typically American, and yet they were playing to this Scandinavian audience. At the same time, two young girls were being the lead singers in groups. They all would subsequently meet in these little folk parks. Keep in mind, there were so many folk parks that a group could perform in 4 or 5 parks on a Saturday, 4 or 5 parks on a Sunday, and in the course of a summer, they could visit a couple of hundred folk parks. So in this way, all the young musicians of the day were in tune with one another because they were all making this cycle, this musical cycle, and performing in these spaces, and ultimately they all met in this way. So in the early 1970s, the four of them came together. The two young men decided that they would be better off writing music together and lyrics together, and they also decided that instead of using only male voices, it was infinitely more interesting to have two compelling young women, especially with incredible vocal ranges, sort of front their music. And so therefore the group was created. Even before they had a name, they had an agent. And the agent would write to them using the initials of their first names. So Anna Fried, Benny, Bjorn, and Alvena. And the end result was that these four names, of course, would spell ABBA, and therefore the birth of the name ABBA. They decided that if they were going to make any impact at all, they had to move out of Sweden. Now keep in mind, let me just set the framework for you about what music was like in Sweden in the early 1970s. They, of course, were very influenced by American pop music. But they were also influenced by Italian pop music, French pop music, English pop music. Of course, this is the birthing of the Beatles at this time. And so they were very aware of what was pertinent and provocative. So they were very smart, and very early on they said, if we're going to make an impact, we're going to have to appear at Eurovision. Eurovision was an international European song contest that in that particular year, 1974, was held in Bristol, England. And the end result was they performed there. They won the contest. The song that they created was called Waterloo. Listen carefully to it. You'll hear it at the end of the show in the curtain call. It's used in an absolutely spectacular way. But that was the birth of ABBA. And so what happened, that song became a #1 hit, not only in England, but literally all over Europe in 1974. If I can just fast forward for you, 25 years later, the group survived for 8 years. I'll talk about that in a few moments. But 25 years later, the Broadway, or the London version of Mamma Mia would open exactly on the same date that it had won the Eurovision contest 25 years earlier. So there is a kind of symmetry to their success. In many ways, it was very calculated. These are very intelligent, very savvy, very musically gifted people. So the two men created the music and lyrics, and the four of them sang these incredible harmonies that were so driven into our minds that once you heard an ABBA song, you spend the rest of your life trying to take it out of your mind. And the end result was then that they were a sensation, and they plotted their success very carefully, and it was a perfect European debut for them. Very quickly after that, they went on a tour of Australia, and they were so loved. And this is when they sort of joined the ranks of the Beatles. Whenever they would go to a city, it was like an invasion. People would literally fill the streets. They had instant fans who adored the music and the words of ABBA. The music was fresh, innovative, sophisticated. It borrowed from the folk tradition of music from Sweden, but it added to it the sophistication of French popular music, Italian popular music, and of course the commercialism then of American music. They sang in English, perfect American idiom English, and the lyrics were really simplistic but very moving, and they would reach an audience very deeply and in a very powerful way. Once you hear an ABBA song, it becomes a part of your DNA. So in an 8-year period then, they went from being an unknown Swedish group to being the second most important rock group in the history of rock music. And the 8 years, constantly creating new material, constantly dazzling, with very innovative and far-out costumes. You'll see references to it in the show you see tonight. And that was the rise of ABBA. Now, keep in mind what happened in that 8-year period. Because they were so enormously successful, they became phenomenally isolated. The two couples married, so literally you had two married couples traveling on the road nonstop, and aside from being on a stage with 20,000 devoted fans screaming, the rest of their lives they were locked away in hotel rooms or taken by police escort to a private airport where they would fly to the next city where they would perform. So it was a very demanding and very difficult lifestyle. Both of the marriages collapsed in that 8-year period, and in 1982, ABBA sang their last concert. It was an amazing event to achieve that level of success in an 8-year period, and it was a worldwide success. And so at that point, the group split up. But what I want you to be aware of is the quality of music that happened in that 8-year period. It's extraordinary rock music, and it's very sophisticated music, and it borrows from the classics. And some of the great composers have influenced the way the sounds are developed and rhythmic ideas are created. So listen carefully to this music. It's very deceiving music because it's so tuneful and it's so comfortable to listen to. You don't really realize how sophisticated it is musically. Okay, so in 1982, then the group disbanded, the marriages broke up, and in that period of time, the music either spanned from the idea of being very joyous music, celebrating life and love, to then very introspective music that dealt with pain, the disintegration of a relationship, with a great song like "The Winner Takes It All." These are very powerful songs. So there's two very strong bodies of songs that existed in that 8-year period. This is important for us because this will be the basis for the music that will be used in the musical we're seeing. Okay, so the two men then, in 1982, had always been very interested in the musical theater, and they became deeply connected with Tim Rice, who had, of course, worked with Andrew Lloyd Webber on Cats. And Tim Rice was setting off on his own to create a musical that would ultimately be called Chess. And so the two men created the lyrics and the music for Chess, which finally found its way to London in 1986. It found its way to New York in 1988. And sadly, in my mind, Chess is the great musical of the 1980s. It never received the respect it should have because it had two very flawed productions. In the production in London, the director was dying of AIDS at the time and never completed the work. And in New York, they completely redid the idea of the show and really spoiled the show. So we have not seen the definitive version of Chess, and in my mind, it stands as a monumental work in the musical theater. So the two men, Benny Andersson and Björn Ulvaeus, really created a masterwork in the musical theater, but it was not well received either in London or in New York. And so at that point, they decided that their relationship with the musical theater was definitely over. Now, enter a woman who would change all of this. Her name is Judy Kramer. Now, Judy Kramer was an assistant to Tim Rice, and she had worked with him on Chess. Her background really was in television and television producing, but this was a very intelligent young woman who very quickly learned all of the business aspects of the musical theater, and she would become the ultimate producer of Mamma Mia. Okay, so Judy Kramer met the men when they were working on Chess because she was an assistant to Tim Rice in this period. And she went to Bjorn and said to him, I am very interested in the body of your music, and I am very interested as a producer in developing a musical based on your music. And both men said, you definitely cannot do a tribute musical. Let me for a moment pause and remind you of this. We're talking about a genre of musical called jukebox musical. And a jukebox musical means that you take music that already exists and you put it into some kind of musical theater format. Most of the shows that have done this have been tributes to composers. There's a musical on the Beatles, there's a musical on Elvis, a large number, Johnny Cash, large numbers of artists have had their work put together, musicalized in the Broadway musical by doing a sort of tribute musical. The ABBA idea, the gentleman said, ABBA was ABBA, no one could reproduce it. It was a unique experience. There were 4 extraordinary voices that came together, creating an extraordinary theatrical event. So we don't want someone doing a sort of copy of us, and we don't want to see a tribute musical to us. But if you can come up with an original story, we'd be very interested in having our music used in this way. Unless you're an amazing theater buff, I don't think there are 10 people in America who remember this, but there had been an ABBA musical in London called Abbacadabra, which was based on their music, but they used different lyrics, and it was created by Alain Boublil, who was the creator of Les Miserables. This was before he did Les Miserables, and he created a children's story using the ABBA music, but it wasn't very successful, so the creators of ABBA were very nervous about having their work, 1, because of Abbacadabra, and then 2, because of the failure of Chess. They weren't very interested in having their work exposed in the musical theater. But Judy Kramer was insistent. She spent 10 years of her life from 1986 to 1996 reviewing all of the ABBA music, categorizing the music, trying to come up with a concept. But keep in mind, she was a producer, not a writer. So she had to find someone who could weave a story together. She had the idea, and she knew that a story could be created, that it had to be a love story. Our musical theater is always about love stories. But when you look at the body of music, you realize that there are these happy, joyous celebrations of life songs, and then there are these darker songs about the despair of a breaking up of a relationship. And she knew that she didn't want to create a kind of Romeo and Juliet story where we had a tragic ending to a love relationship. That really wouldn't work in the musical theater. And so the end result was she had a very strong sense that this could work, but didn't have a handle on how to do it. So finally, 10 years after this work happened, so we're now into 1996, she reconnected with Bjorn and said to him, I have all this music in place. I'm ready to proceed with it. I have interest in financing for this work, and I'm just about to settle on a writer. Are you still interested? And he said, as long as it's original story, I'm interested in developing this project. And so at this point, she went through agents in London to find out who the hot young writers were. Now, I want you to remember about Judy Kramer. Judy Kramer had never produced a musical. She spent 10 years of her life working on it. She had these other skills because she had produced on television. She had been around musicals because she worked with the best, Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber, so she saw how it was done, but she had never had any firsthand experience. We know that a producer's job is to raise money, bring the artists together, supervise the production, make certain that it ends in the black and is successful, handle the distribution of it, et cetera. It's a very demanding and all-encompassing job. So Judy Kramer had many of the right credentials, but she was new at it. And again, keep in mind, this has been a profession that's been very strongly dominated by men. And so suddenly here's this young, very eager woman who's eager to proceed. She has a lot of music contacts, so she's able to raise money, but she still doesn't have the piece together. So at this point, she starts putting the word out that she's looking for a writer, and several people suggested to her a young woman named Katherine Johnson. Now, Katherine Johnson, again, had never worked on a musical. Katherine Johnson is a playwright and a television writer. She'd written a lot of series for English television, especially for the BBC. So she was a little highbrow. She wrote exceedingly well. She was very gifted as a writer. She had had several very successful plays produced at the Bristol Old Vic, a very distinguished theater. But she had never had experience doing a musical. And so a meeting was set up with Judy Kramer and Katherine Johnson. And when they met, Katherine Johnson, incidentally, by this point was a single mother, divorced, with 2 children, having a tremendous responsibility of raising 2 young children and trying to write. She was doing about seven different television series at the same time, writing one episode for something. So she was very overworked and very pressured and really very out of her league in terms of thinking about the musical theater. So these 2 women met. And Judy Kramer is a very imposing, powerful woman. And she sort of said to her, I'll give you 2 weeks to come up with an idea, review all the ABBA material, and in 2 weeks come back with a story outline. I'm ready to move on this, and I have to move quickly. And Katherine Johnson thought in her mind that she was going back home to the West Country of England where she lived, where 2 children would take up all her time. So she said, let's talk about this a little bit. You can't do a love story that ends in a disaster. We've got to find a way of making this a story that can be a joyous celebration of life. And so very quickly she came up with the idea of saying, why don't we do a generational story, where it's a story about a mother and her daughter, and we talk about love relationships on 2 different levels. So they started to be interested in that. And then Katherine realized that when she got up to leave, that if she didn't have an idea before she left, she probably never would have time to develop a storyline. And so she said to Judy, what would you think of a mother who had a relationship with 3 different men and didn't know who her daughter's father was. And that, of course, is the basis for the story that we see, that is done in a very delightful and very charming way. I mean, this is the musical that asks us, who's your daddy? You know, and that's what happens here. And it's a delightful story in the way it's told. And so very quickly then, they decided that this could be a 2-generational mother-daughter story, that they could each have their love stories going on separately, and that this might be delightful. They decided that it should be set in a Greek island, that it should be celebratory, and that, of course, was the basis for this delightful script. Now, the only other thing I want to tell you about the storyline, it tells itself wonderfully, and you will enjoy it in the most delightful way. But Katherine Johnson is really a very, very clever writer, because right from the very beginning, Judy Kramer said the music must be organic, meaning that it must be right in the telling of the story. Keep in mind, when you listen to the ABBA songs, each of those songs tell little stories. That was in the tradition of French music at the time and Italian music at the time, where a song would literally tell a story. And so she studied those songs very carefully and was able to connect the songs in a brilliant way with the storyline she created about the mother and the daughter and a wedding that was being planned. And so it's a great delight to see how that was developed. The one thing I want to remind you of, this storyline is really very Shakespearean in idea. Of course, you know, this woman is a very intelligent writer, and she spent a lot of time working on the BBC and was always very exposed to the classics. And in many ways, while none of the critics have written about this, it's very like Shakespeare's The Tempest. From the standpoint, The Tempest took place on an island. Everyone's life is turned upside down. Everyone changes because of going to the island. All of those basic ingredients that are in the Shakespearean story of The Tempest are exactly the same ingredients that are used in the most delightful and yet contemporary way in telling this sort of delightful little fairy tale that unfolds in the storyline. So it's very cleverly done. Those of you who know the ABBA music, one of the things that happens with an audience that really knows that music is they can't wait to see how the next ABBA song will be developed. And it's very cleverly done. So it works on so many different levels. So the idea is Judy Kramer found the perfect writer to put this material together that would link a compelling and delightful story that was very contemporary, that we could relate to, that is a love story that functions on many different levels. There's intrigue, there's excitement, there's a lot of suspense, just as there is in The Tempest, and it's magical and enchanted in the same way that The Tempest is. And so it's a delightful way of telling a story. Keep in mind, Mamma Mia would not only go on to be one of the greatest musicals created in the 21st century, but it would set a new standard for jukebox musicals in the idea that you could really develop a story using music that had already existed in another form. And you know, we had that experience in early movies. We saw Meet Me in St. Louis and Blackboard Jungle. These were shows that used contemporary music in the telling of the story. And so the end result was that the movies experimented with this idea of jukebox musical, taking songs and creating a story to go around the songs in popular movie, like Singing in the Rain also, keep in mind. So these are early antecedents. But the first great musical to develop this then would be Mamma Mia. So it was a perfect choice to find this brilliant young woman who was able to create such a compelling storyline. But again, remember, she had had no background in the musical theater. She was really writing a story. Okay, and then they hired a director, Phillida Lloyd. And again, this is a woman who had very impeccable credentials in England. She had staged operas. She had staged very esoteric works for the great classical companies, the Royal Shakespeare Company and the National Theatre of England. So this is a very important director. And yet she had had no experience of ever directing a musical. So the end result was the 3 primary artists who came together, the producer, the writer, and the director, all came from outside of the musical theater. And they would create a musical that was so compelling, so popular, so pleasing to an audience that it would transform the way musicals were created. The director, for example, would spend a lot of time saying, we have to make this all very believable. I really don't want dances as in a Broadway production number. I want the dance to come out of the experience of where they are, what they're doing, what's happening. If they're in the taverna, if they're drinking, I just want to see people dancing the way the audience might dance to music like this. So the whole tone of this show was to make it as real as possible and as accessible to an audience as possible. And that's what the director did with this material. So watch for this closely. I mean, it's so appealing to us, and we jump into it, and we're taken by the story very early on, but realize all of the devices that are used to pull you into the story, which is an absolute delight. The aim has always been to make it as real and as believable as possible. Even though it's a kind of fairy tale story, to tell the story as truthfully and as organically as possible. And that's what's happened with the show. So it becomes a great delight in the way it's created. When the show opened in London, it was an enormous success. They did a workshop of it before, and then they took it into London, and it was an incredible success from the first day. But it was really, the critics loved the show, but it was really the audience that spread a word of mouth that literally went around the world. I mean, when you think about the numbers of people, as I've told you, 50 million people have seen this musical. It's an extraordinary experience. And then to just show you one other aspect of this, Judy Kramer, the producer, controlled every aspect of this show. And so every time a new production of it would open in Switzerland, in Mexico, in Russia, she would make certain that it was using the idiom of the people and the idiom of the place, so that every production they did in every country had its own uniqueness and fit into that country's standard and quality of art in a very special way. She's been an amazing woman. And then, when they were ready to make the movie, keep in mind the movie of Mamma Mia is the most successful financial musical movie ever made. And it was because Judy Kramer would not sell it to Hollywood. She would not give it simply to stars to take over and do it. She controlled every aspect of the show, and the same team came in and adjusted the work as a movie. I find the movie a great delight with Meryl Streep. If you haven't seen it, by all means, I think you should go back and see it. It's a delightful work. I think you're in for an absolutely delightful experience. You know, the English audience is one of the most conservative audiences in the world. I saw it the first week of the opening of the show when it opened in 1999. And, you know, English matrons were dancing in the aisle, so be careful. You may turn into a dancing queen yourself tonight. So in any case, enjoy an absolutely remarkable show with memorable music and wonderfully told in a very sophisticated and delightful way. Enjoy Mamma Mia. Thank you.